Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. Throughout the year 2025, mobile internet in Russia was shut down more than 11,000 times. The shutdowns were recorded in 80 regions of the country. In 25 of them, mobile internet went offline every single day. The pattern rules out accidents, weather, or some freak failure. You could perhaps blame infrastructure, but Russian internet can't be that bad. I still get like 2 of them in every Counter-Strike lobby. What is being shut down here is not access to the internet itself, but access on demand. And when something is cut this consistently, it stops being an emergency response, it becomes policy. The authorities explained the shutdowns with security concerns. If that were true though, the pattern would be obvious, more volatile places, more shutdowns, right? But the geography breaks that explanation. Mobile internet is shut down far more often in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and nearby regions than in places like the North Caucasus. A region the state itself treats as especially sensitive. So this is not about security, it's about where silence is the easiest to impose. In this system, security means less communication, especially less information. So by the end of 2025, mobile internet shutdowns were no longer an emergency measure. They became routine. The authorities explained this with security requirements, a magic phrase that works equally well for disabling communications and disabling common sense. But the real objective is simpler and much more systematic: gradual digital isolation. There is a telling detail. During the shutdowns, services from the so-called whitelist, approved by the Kremlin and controlled by the state, continues to function. So the internet does not disappear, it is just filtered, curated, allowed only in its correct form. These shutdowns are just one layer. At the same time, authorities ban independent messengers, online services, and even games. Apparently, chat rooms and virtual tank are more dangerous than corruption in the real world. The outcome is simple. Access is narrowed to what the state allows, alternatives disappear, discussion disappears. The internet does not collapse, it is managed. 11,000 shutdowns a year are not accidents, they are the result of deliberate decisions made over and over again. This is not about safety, it is how control is exercised. The internet is allowed to exist, but only as a channel for approved content. On Vladimir Solovyov's show, something happened again that in a normal country would be called a scandal, but in Russia passes for analysis. Another studio expert, whose entire resume is just being a regular guest and being very loud, announced that Ukrainians themselves are to blame for the strikes on infrastructure. The logic is familiar and indestructible. If a missile hits your house, then clearly you should not have been living there. And from there, the conversation moved smoothly to calls for intensifying the strikes. More blackouts, more cold, more cities without electricity, water, and heat. All of this was framed not as a war crime, but as a strategy. According to the television hawks, depriving millions of civilians of basic living conditions is almost a humanitarian act. No electricity? No problems. It is worth noting where these ideas are voiced from. Warm studios, stable power, hot water, coffee machines working without interruption. It is easy to sound ruthless when the light never go out.
У вас остается только один способ добиться поставленных целей. Это добиться их военным путем. И в этом плане, как мне представляется, интенсивность ударов по объектам военно-промышленного комплекса Украины, вооруженных сил Украины, коммуникациям, объектам топливно-энергетического комплекса должна быть резко усилена. И что касается, опять-таки, операций, ударов по объектам противника, то вот их интенсивность должна быть резко увеличена. Почему? Потому что, раз не доходит с помощью слов, раз украинская сторона демонстрирует себя как явно недоговороспособная, это остается единственным способом решения проблем, то есть сугубо военное решение. И ведь когда возникнут вот типа вопросы у самых широких слоев украинского населения. Как же так получается, что мы останемся без света, холодной воды, канализации, электричества, что в ходе боевых действий мы вновь понесем самые тяжелые и безвозвратные, и санитарные потери, что территория нашей страны будет подвергнута массированным ударам, разрушению, то, собственно говоря, кто виновен в этом, во всем? Ну, военно-политическое руководство Украины, которое никак не может согласиться, скажем так, на вполне приемлемые условия, достижения хотя бы каких-либо договоренностей.
You see, Russia cannot achieve decisive success on the battlefield, so the war is redirected at civilians, at children, women, the elderly, at people who do not carry weapons but carry flashlights through dark stairwells and wait for kettles that never boil. These are not side effects, it is a deliberate tactic of terror dressed up as television chatter. When missiles do not deliver victory, propaganda is tasked with explaining why the victims are to blame. These statements are not just words, they publicly justify crimes and shift responsibility from the aggressor onto those being attacked. Kremlin television proves the rule once again that when arguments run out, cynicism takes over. While most countries are planning economic development, social payments, infrastructure projects, Vladimir Putin has made a different choice, continuing the war. The decree to call up reservists for military training in 2026 makes the priority unmistakable. The regime has no intention of backing away from its imperial ambitions, even if the bill is paid in economic stability. By the end of 2025, Russia's military spending exceeded the plan by almost 20%. The Ministry of Defense expects total spending to reach $198.8 billion, or 7.3% of GDP. That's $30 billion more than budgeted. You could call it a premium upgrade. Now, every week, the state burns through $2.7 billion during the war. For comparison, that amount could cover the annual budget of a large region with a salary paid, a school and hospitals repaired. And instead, regions are loaded with costs for contract soldiers, compensation to families of the dead, treatment of the wounded, prosthetics, burials. For many parts of the Federation, this burden is unsustainable, especially with falling oil and gas revenue and ongoing budget cuts. In a normal country, this level of military spending would set off alarms about an approaching economic crisis. In Russia, it becomes a survival exercise. How to keep the system running while feeding imperial ambition. Putin's priorities are clear. War for historic lands comes before teachers' salaries, road repairs, or investment in the economy. When nearly 7% of GDP goes to war and people struggle to pay utility bills, patriotism is left to do the explaining. Russian propaganda has once again reached for its most reliable instrument: disinformation dressed up as concern for ordinary people. This time, the target is Bulgaria, which plans to join the eurozone on January 1st of 2026. Now, judging by the sudden spike of bot activity and coordinated messaging, Moscow has taken this decision not as an economic choice, but as a personal provocation. Bulgarian special services have established that networks of social media accounts linked to Russia simultaneously push scare stories about skyrocketing prices, loss of economic sovereignty, and a familiar warning about Brussels' dictatorship. The message is deliberately simple. The euro is presented not as a currency, but as a threat. As if the moment euro coins appear in wallets, prices will explode and national identity will dissolve. One detail is consistently missing from those experts, though. Countries that have already joined the eurozone did not collapse and did not switch to bartering potatoes, but facts really survive contact with a propaganda campaign. There is a certain irony in a state whose own currency requires constant bans, manual controls, and emergency measures suddenly expressing deep concern for the fate of the Bulgarian lev. This is not about prices or pensions. Russia uses disinformation to interfere in key decisions inside the European Union, backing radical and pro-Russian forces and trying to create friction wherever it can. The Bulgarian case makes that very clear. The louder the warnings about the euro, the more obvious it becomes that the issue is not just money but geopolitics. And the euro remains what it has always been, just the currency, but one with a quality that Kremlin finds deeply inconvenient. It does bring countries together. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.